A year since the final state capture reports were released, 4 years of work, 400 days of hearings, 19 volumes of findings. The Commission probed the systematic takeover of the boards of state-owned enterprises and other government departments to favour contracts largely linked to the Gupta family. Since then, we have seen some action on the findings and recommendations on the report, but undoubtedly still a very long way to go. Paul Holden is an author and director of Shadow World Investigations. He's dedicated many years to exposing corruption. In fact, he started with the arms deal back in 1999. He's recently released Zondo at Your Fingertips. It's a summary of the main findings of the Commission and its recommendations for further investigation and reform. Holden himself was involved in presenting testimony at the Commission, also part of the team trying to follow the money flows. He joins us now from London. Paul, thank you so much for your time. You know, we've heard quite a lot of input on what Chief Justice Zondo had to say. He was clearly really angry. He believes that if Parliament had done its work back then, this could have been stopped in its tracks. But he also says we're vulnerable to state capture, as others believe. We've just had a response from Parliament, and they basically are angry with the Chief Justice, saying that he's overstepped the separation of powers, that they say Parliament is actually working on reforms, and it takes time, but they're doing what they can to try and improve matters. You know, speaking to Karam Singh of Corruption Watch a little earlier, he said, to be fair, there are quite a lot of small things that are underway. But the truth is the big wins, the Guptas, are not back in South Africa facing trial. Do you think that we are being fair to the South African government in its efforts to create a new way that makes us immune to state capture?
I don't think you're being unfair. And first of all, I should say thank you for having me. You know, I think the Zondo Commission ran for a very long period of time. It ran for 4 years. And obviously, people were waiting to find out what Zondo would actually recommend and find. But it was pretty clear through those 4 years, for anybody paying attention, that there was a serious problem here. And there was a serious problem with our oversight mechanisms in particular. So it's not like Zondo delivered his report and then suddenly it was a surprise that there were problems that had to be resolved. You know, he gave very particular technical solutions that had to be implemented. But you would have felt that if there was a degree of urgency in preparing for the report to come out, considering the implications of what had been heard, and then being raring to go when the report was actually finalized, you would have seen some action by now. So I don't think it's unfair. And you could see that, you could sense that there was a palpable frustration in the way that Zondo made his findings about Parliament, about oversight, about the conduct of the ANC in particular during the state capture period. And he clearly felt, when he was writing the report and still feels it now, that this was a body that was supposed to perform a function and it utterly and totally failed in doing so. And I think most South Africans are worried that it's going to do it again.
Yeah. Chief Justice Zondo today was saying there's no doubt the Guptas in particular meticulously planned their infiltration of the many boards that held the power to control who got tenders. And reading through your book, which itself is a weighty tome that is a lot smaller than all those volumes, I have to say, well done on crunching that information. But it is a reminder that there was a very clear pattern of takeover because it was reproduced again and again and again, and it worked very effectively. But the big fish are still out there. 1 year on, we failed to extradite the Gupta brothers. In fact, they skipped out of Dubai. We understand they could be in Vanuatu. Do you think that we're ever going to get them back to South Africa to answer?
I think it's a very difficult question, I have to be honest. And while I'm generally quite optimistic that we're going to be seeing action on a whole range of different things over time, I'm very pleased to see, for example, the amount of money that's been seized in South Africa, the asset forfeiture application to seize Optimum Coal Mine, for example, the SIU applications, all the money paid back by McKinsey. These are concrete results that I think we should celebrate. In terms of getting the Guptas back, there's a part of me that feels that we need to be quite realistic about that possibility. To my mind, there's very little that the South African authorities can actually do now to get them back. And I say that because, not because of any failings on the part of the South African government, but because Dubai is effectively a global criminal tax haven, and it makes its money and makes its business to offer people a safe place to park their illicit money from around the world. This is the national business model. And a national business model like that doesn't really permit the operation of extradition proceedings. And I've done quite a lot of research on Dubai extraditions, and I actually spoke to the one person who was properly extradited for a serious economic crime the day before he was extradited. I was investigating that case. And there was a case of, it was a guy called Christian Michel who was being extradited from Dubai to India. It took extraordinary political pressure from India, one of the most powerful countries in the world, to get Dubai to release this one person. I'm not entirely sure that we should be banking that hard on the Guptas coming back. I would rather see a focus on two things. One is the officials who were implicated in state capture, and two is the multinationals and enablers that were involved in state capture. Those we can go after. Those we can go after right now.
And you make the point that some of them have already had their assets frozen, and some of them have even paid back some of the money. And more of that, please. Yes, that makes us feel very good. You speak about the officials. We know that Brian Molefe and Siyabonga Gama and others are in court. The early stages, of course, around the Transnet corruption, which, as you've explained so well in your book, is really the biggest chunk of state capture. Is it cases like that that give you a great deal of hope?
I mean, I suppose we have to see how that case is prosecuted. I am a little bit concerned with those cases because of the number of people who've been arrested and indicted at the same time. Which makes for a very complicated prosecution, because you could have a situation where you have 20 people indicted, and they all have very expensive defense attorneys with their own defense teams up against the state. But I do think that what we do have is an incredible bedrock of evidence that the Commission has provided. The Commission really dug deep into these topics, and around Transnet in particular, it's pretty incontrovertible. The violations of the Public Finance Management Act, and also the money flows and who benefited from it. So I'm hoping in that case we'll have a better outcome than we did in New Lane. And I'm hoping that with the New Lane case, the MPA has taken recognition and taken notice of the fact that these are not going to be easy cases. They can't just rely on a sympathetic judge to overlook the flaws in their case. They have to present the best case as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, New Lane linked to the Estina dairy farm. And that was an absolute travesty. That was meant to help farmers in that area who were very poor, and it did nothing for them. It essentially just cycled money through that farm. But New Lane, that case, the entire case collapsed, which is very worrying indeed. So you make a good point that these have to be thoroughly investigated. Speaking of the money flows, I was reading a little bit about PRASA, and in fact I interviewed Popo Molefe, who did so much to try and expose the state capture that was going on at PRASA. And this is where you speak about the bombshell in Popo Molefe's affidavit, which essentially implicates the ANC as getting direct kickbacks from PRASA's Swifambo deal, which is the Spanish train deal, the toll trains deal. Ultimately, Molefe's contact pretty much walked back what he'd said to Molefe, so they haven't been able to follow it. But why haven't the Hawks followed the money in that particular case? I mean, maybe they have, and we just don't know about it, but that could lead a trail directly to the ANC, to officials who need to be rooted out if the ANC is honest and authentic in wanting to renew itself.
I mean, I think there's so many cases that the Hawks and the MPA have to prosecute, right? They have to prosecute them well. I have no insight into how they're prioritizing those cases, sadly. But I agree that this is, one of the more egregious and obvious cases of corruption, just because the underlying essence of the deal is so obviously flawed. We bought trains that don't run on our network properly. I mean, you can't explain that by any means besides for violation of procurement policies, left, right, and centre. I mean, what is very clear is that there were two places that I picked up, rereading the reports again from Zondo. There's two places where he was very worried. And one was PRASA, and the other one was the State Security Agency. Because he felt that even in the time the Commission was sitting, there had been a return to old ways of doing business, and that actually at PRASA things were getting worse rather than getting better. And I think, I was just hearing one of the things you were saying earlier, what could have been done in the interim since the report came out. Well, Zondo says very clearly that we need a commission of inquiry into PRASA and to its misfunction and its dysfunction. And that's something that we desperately need and could have been done pretty quickly.
I have to close, but I do want to ask you a broader question, because you've looked at corruption over many years. You wrote a book on the arms deal corruption, which we're still hoping to bring to trial. It strikes me, and this is where I really want your insight. It seems the big fish somehow managed to wriggle off the hook. And if we go back to apartheid days, P.W. Botha got out of a jail term for not appearing at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on a technicality because the term of the commission had officially expired. He had so much to answer for, but he never did. Jacob Zuma has yet to answer for the arms deal corruption, let alone face any charges around state capture. The Guptas that ship may have sailed. It's very frustrating for ordinary people who dutifully pay their taxes and try not to break the law. Should we just accept that the big fish get away and just do the best we can with the rank and file corruptors?
I mean, I think, you're really talking about a history of extreme impunity here. And I'm afraid we just can't let people get away with it. It's very hard. It's very hard to get there. It's often very disappointing. It's strenuous and it's arduous, but it's not the sort of thing you can give up, because if you give up fighting impunity, you're effectively giving up on the idea of a responsive democratic state. And no matter how ugly the fight, it's a fight that we have to have and have to continue to have. I mean, what I will say, this is a very tough area. There's reason for cynicism and pessimism a lot of the time. But I will say one of the things that I've spent 15 years investigating corruption around the world, and I've been based around the world and studied in different places. And I will say that the Zondo Commission was something quite different from anything I've experienced in my career up until that point, in that it really actually tried to investigate. And I say to people when I've been launching my book that the Zondo Commission was the worst of us appearing before some of the best of us. And I feel like we should stop focusing so hard on the worst of us and recognize the work of the best of us, the people like the evidence leaders and the investigators, the result of which I think is very important. In the arms deal, because of the extent of the pushback and the capture of the MPA and all sorts of different things, and because of the balance of political forces at the time, if we were to tackle the arms deal now, the question would still be, was the arms deal corrupt? In my mind, it's clearly, obviously corrupt. We don't have to do the state capture anymore. We're not asking the question, did state capture happen? That's been established. We've gotten over that hurdle, which is actually quite a big thing to achieve, not just in South Africa, but actually globally, to get to a point where society acknowledges the extent of corruption and the players behind it. Now we think that, once you've crossed that hurdle, which is what Zondo did, we need to take up the mantle and do what we can, everything we possibly can. And it's an all society thing. Everybody has to be involved in whatever way they can be, to make sure there isn't impunity. Because if there is impunity, there's not much of a state left.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And I think that your book, Zondo at Your Fingertips, is one way of crunching that incredible information into a very accessible format, because you give such interesting insights, as well as just the information, the evidence that came out of the Commission. Thank you so much for the work that you do and for giving us a little bit of hope, even when things seem really bleak. We really appreciate your time with us this evening. Paul Holden is author and director of Shadow World Investigations, recently releasing that book, Zondo at Your Fingertips, a guide to the state capture findings. Now,